Hello and welcome to another cables.gl video. So in this video we are going to look at the prompt intersections for January 4. Let's get started. So we will look at how to create this interesting looking animation or motion graphic by using cables.gl. So whatever buttons I click, you can see them in the bottom left corner of the screen so that it's easier to follow. So let's get started by putting in our basic operators, which are the main loop to initialize the canvas or like the entire patch, followed by a sequence op, which is like the primary sequence op that helps us control our render, flow, um, image compose or post-processing effects, and the full screen rectangle to kind of display everything. So let's add in a render to texture operator, an image compose, and a draw image pair, and the full screen rectangle. Let's connect the input output texture ports to kind of take all of the information from render to texture and display it in our full screen rectangle. Once we have this, it's time for our geometry. So let's put in another sequence operator. So in the motion graphic or the animated video, you saw that we had like a cube and a sphere. So let's get started by adding in a cube and let's drop in a sphere. So currently the sphere seems to be invisible, but that's just because it's kind of like a similar shape as the cube. So if I disconnect this particular op, then you can get to see the other one. Or if I reduce the size, then you can see that the sphere is still there. So let's just reset it for now and let it be. Now what we need is a line that kind of goes across, and we want to kind of transform this entire thing. So let's start out by adding a transform to this thing. Now if we change the x-axis values, then we see that it is transforming. What we want to do is to kind of disappear half of this cube and disappear half of the sphere and kind of show only the one half of them. So let's add in this op called area discard pixel and set this to x axis infinite and set the 1 equals to 0. So you see half of the uh, cube displayed in here. If I put it to 0 minus 0.1, 0.01, then you can see the other half of it. Same goes for the cube, but this time we will set it to 0. So you have like two halves of two different things. Let's add in clear color op. We want to kind of have some control over our background, and let's add in the orthogonal op. So you see that both are like of a similar size. So what happens if we don't use this op is now they are of different sizes because there's some sort of like a perspective thing going on. So when you see that the sphere comes towards the edge, it looks more elongated. Same with the cube, it's kind of elongated, but if we drop in this orthogonal app, then it looks more like a square rather than a cube. Now let's add in a timer followed by an LFO, and then plug this into our transform. So you can see we have the basic kind of like animation ready for something that we were trying to make. So we need to put in like a line to kind of distinguish these two things. So let's add in another sequence to kind of add in our line. So our default line goes from 0, 0, 0 to 1, 1, 1, which is kind of like a weird angle, but we need a vertical line. So let's set the y1 value to 4 and y2 value to -4, setting all x2 and z2 values to 0. So we now have a vertical line where these kind of like, which represents the kind of like intersecting point or intersecting plane. So what we want to do next is add in some basic materials. Let's get started by adding a PBR environment light. Okay, and let's add in some texture. And for the file, let's use some default RGB array texture. So we have the one half of the material setup. So let's kind of add in the PBR materials for our cube and another one for our sphere. Let's go with some grayscale values, so like a brighter color for the sphere and like somewhat of a grayish tone for our cube. You can play around with the other values to kind of have like different kinds of effects and reflections and whatnot. So our primary scene is almost ready. Let's drop in a transform view. We want to have like this entire thing in a different angle. Let's change the angle of rotation around z-axis by 90 degrees, so we see that it goes up and down in some manner. Let's change the scale to 0.5 so that we see more of the scene. And what we also want to have is that when it approaches the center, it becomes faster. So let's add in another LFO, add in additional addition of and add these two things. So now you can see that this goes faster when it's kind of transitioning in between these two planes, or like when it's crossing this plane. So we can also change the aspect ratio to 1:1 to kind of have like a better view of what's going on. So what we want to do next is to kind of invert the colors whenever it crosses this plane. So for that, what we are going to use is to add it to a color map and hook it up to our color palette op. And then whenever this is crossing, we change the color to something. So we need to kind of figure out when this thing crosses this center plane or center line of sorts, right? So this entire thing is driven by this LFO. So this LFO basically gives us values between -1 and 1. So essentially what we can do is reduce the range using map range and take the values from -1 to 1 to something like 0.9 to 0.9. So the reason why we are doing this is because we want to kind of reduce the values to 2 digits, right? In this case, if we do a floor, so the values that we end up getting are either -1 or 0. So 2 digits are like two numbers are like easier to work with than 3, because in this case the values that we can get are like -1, 0, and 1. So once we have this, what we can do next is to plug in an equals operator and check whether this value is uh, either -1 or 0. So for this instance, we will take this value to be 0. So whenever it hits 0, it gives us, um, okay, yes, it is a 0, or otherwise, if it's -1, then it says that, okay, no, it is not 0, right? So we have two choices. So what we are going to do next is put in an if else sort of a statement. So there's this op called if true then. It's a trigger specific op that triggers something if it is true and triggers something else if it is false. And we hook it up to our equals because it also gives us values in Boolean, true and false, right? So now what we want to do is if it is true, then set number on trigger. And if it is false, then set some other number, right? And then connect these to the color palette op and then choose a different number. And you see that we are already getting somewhere, so you can just play around a bit to kind of select your own numbers on the basis of whatever you want to look like. But I think that's mostly it, and we are done. So what do you think? Simple enough. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for the next one. Bye bye.